The other thing that I forgot to mention is that we are recording this virtual think tank, and it will be on our YouTube channel later today, or at least by Monday morning, so that others can have access to this information, and also if you need it for your own purposes. Also wanted to share with you 3 upcoming virtual think tanks and their topics. The first one is going to be on October 30th, which will focus on online instruction and the CalTPA, providing guidance, tips, and tools. We do have one on December the 4th, supporting preliminary TPA and PS VTW candidates in completing the CalTPA. And finally, on January 29th, I will be providing an update on the Education Specialist CalTPA and the pilot study. So I will be giving you some information with regard to that information. Also, we have some program supports that are important. Our faculty workshop will be on October 27th from 8 a.m. to 3 p.m. You can register for this event through Eventbrite, and that information is contained in the PSD e-news. The results analyzer demo is going to be on October the 12th from 1:30 to 3:30. As a reminder, this is only for programs that are enrolled or have access to the results analyzer information. So it is going to be for those programs that do have the information in order to be able to access this program, and that will be provided by Evaluation Systems. And finally, just a reminder that we do have weekly office hours, and they are listed here. We provide information for induction candidates who are on an executive order preliminary or a program-sponsored VTW. Also, we have induction hours for our teacher induction staff. And finally, preliminary program staff is always from Thursdays, 10 a.m. to 10:30 a.m. Last item I would like to address before we turn it over to our presenters is that the Commission has its own YouTube channel. We encourage you to access this information. If you haven't already, you can sign up to receive, to be a subscriber to the YouTube channel, and that way you'll get updates whenever there is something posted to the YouTube channel, and it is free to do so. And finally, we have our own playlist, which is accessed through this bit.ly. It is case sensitive, so please make sure that when you access this information that you do capitalize and lowercase it appropriately. Otherwise, you will get an error message. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Delia, Kitty, and Letitia, who will walk us through utilizing the tools of cultural proficiency to address implicit bias.
Thank you so much, James. Before we begin, the first thing I would like to is thank each and every one of you for taking the time for being here with us. We need to acknowledge that many of you are already doing training in implicit bias. You may be teaching the class. You may be working with many people on this issue. We would like to invite you to join in and share your expertise. This is about coming together and sharing what we know and how to approach it. While it may seem repetitive, we need to have this opportunity to discuss and learn from each other. It is so important to have this discussion together as a community as we prepare educators to serve the children of California. So without further ado, if we can go to the next slide. Here are our outcomes for today. We'd like to build a common understanding of implicit bias. Second, we'd like to learn how to use the tools of cultural proficiency to address implicit bias. And we also want to know how implicit bias can be manifest in our work. Next slide. So let's begin with an exercise. If you have something to write with and something to jot down with, if you could get that right now. Okay. I'm wondering if you know how you would complete the following statements. They're very simple statements. You're going to choose 3 words for each. First statement is, I am. The second is, I am not. Let me model it for you. I am big, Latina, and single. I am not stupid, lazy, or miserable. Okay? How would you answer those two statements? I'll give you a minute or two to jot that down. So when I asked you to do this exercise, how did it make you feel? Do you feel to unmute yourselves and share?
It validates who we are and what we are not.
Right. So that actually makes you be introspective for a second. How do I see myself, right? And how might others see me? Anyone else? If you're not comfortable, you can put it in the chat room and I'll share it there. So something to consider in those two very simple statements. What it's leading you to do is to analyze, number one, how you perceive yourself. And at the same time, it's asking you to acknowledge how others see you. And we're negotiating that on a daily basis all the time. It's a struggle for some. It may even make you feel uncomfortable because we're going to a place of reflection about how we navigate the world. This is at the heart of our work today, especially if we're going to talk about bias. How does this work inform us of how we see the world and how the world reacts to us? And what are the challenges that it places before us? Next slide. So have any of you seen this image before? Look familiar? It has been used quite broadly, actually, to consider the work of equity and access. It is one iteration of our understanding of what our work is as educators. So what these images show us is, are we preparing students to simply view the game? Are we preparing them to truly become part of the game? Think about that. Who are we including, showing, or discussing? Who's visible? Who's not? What barriers exist? And how does this image really define us in terms of what we think access and equity is? This is what we should be striving for, or it attempts to define that. So we have to, in this type of work, understand that it is an ever-evolving feature. It continues to evolve over time and redefine itself because it's built on our ever-growing understandings of this work. It's a journey primarily about us and who we are together. It is a constant striving to understand what is occurring and how to handle it. So to this point, if we go to the next image. It continues to evolve. Who's now included? Who is participating? Who is being acknowledged? So it's just not simply about playing the game, but are we really committed to making sure they have full access to being part of the game as well? There is no simple answer. We only have worthy lines of investigation, which must be pursued. So what does this mean as we prepare educational leaders and teachers, particularly as we prepare them for the exams they need to take? Next slide. So as we talk about implicit bias, at the same time, I want to talk about cultural proficiency. You may be familiar with the framework. It's been used broadly. But I want to really highlight that there are 5 tools here, 4 tools that can be used to understand this work, okay? Particularly around implicit bias. Now, again, this is not an in-depth training in the framework, but it will help us to understand how we move forward. So the very first tool is understanding barriers. We have to understand there are real barriers out there, implicit bias being one of them. They need to be acknowledged and understood. 2, under guiding principles, we need to understand what our values are if we're really going to do this work. Most of our work is dealing with the ethical tension between who we say we are and what we actually do and how we handle those barriers. Then we have the cultural proficiency continuum that talks if we are able to identify healthy and unhealthy behaviors that occur in the sites that we work with, and also the essential elements. What are the actions that educators take to ensure that equity and access occurs? We'll have a little bit more time a little later, but let's begin with implicit bias. Next slide.
All right, so let's take a moment and I want you just to look at this definition. And in the chat box, I'd like for you to write from that definition one word that resonates with you. Just write one word in the chat box that resonates with you. So continuing with that definition, one of the things that I'd like to bring to your attention is the idea that it's automatic, and unconscious. And there's great power in thinking about the idea that this is just the way things are, that it doesn't take any work for this to occur. And why is that important? Well, it's important because it seems that it's so ingrained in our sense of normal. We're completely unaware most of the time. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the responses. Let me see, what do we have in there? I see a lot of that automatic. I see unconscious. I see denial, automatic, unconscious, very good. And it's true, we don't even think about that oftentimes when it is taking place. Next slide, let's look a little bit further and see what's going on. So we have a video. Go ahead and start it. While watching the video, I want you to add words to your list. I want you to add some words to your list, and I want you to put those in the chat box also. Did we lose James? Oh no, he's there.
No, I'm here. Sorry.
I see you.
I'm here. I'm sorry. I think we're going to have to play it through YouTube. So I'm going to do that right now. I apologize. Okay. Can you just, when I'm playing it, can you just verify that it is indeed playing and you can hear it? I'm so sorry. Can you see the screen with this?
We cannot hear it though.
The video, you can't hear it?
No.
Yeah, sometimes when you have on your earphones, it stops us from hearing it. Another option is as soon as you hit share, click share computer audio if it wasn't already checked.
Okay, hold on. So.
And your share up at the top, yeah. It says share computer audio.
Okay, share. Is it leave computer audio or?
No. It's in your when you go to the top, where you know how you have the options, if you look at more options, you'll see something that says share computer audio.
Up at the top with the
yeah, the little 3 dots, I think is where it's at.
Okay.
Yeah. It could be under your share, where you say share screen. It could be right there. It's in one of those 2 places.
Oh, share computer sounds.
Okay. Yes, there you go.
Is it playing now?
The biases are basically thought process.
Yes, but can you go back to the beginning? Sorry.
Little mental shortcuts that hold.
Sorry.
Okay, So while you're watching, if you can just go ahead and take some notes on this also, maybe jot those in the chat box.
Implicit bias.
Implicit bias.
Implicit bias.
2016 was the year that implicit bias went somewhat mainstream.
Yeah, so when Hillary Clinton mentioned implicit bias in the debates, our phones started blowing up, all our friends started emailing us about it.
But what is implicit bias? Implicit biases are basically thought processes that happen without you even knowing it. Little mental shortcuts that hold judgments you might not agree with. And sometimes those shortcuts are based on race. First, some clarity. Saying someone has an implicit bias is different from calling someone a racist.
The word racist is a highly loaded term, right, here in American society. A lot of times, when people are using it, they're thinking of the kind of old-fashioned Ku Klux Klan style racist.
But implicit bias isn't anywhere near that, explicit.
Implicit bias is something that comes out of ordinary mental functioning, out of how the mind normally works.
We've all grown up in a culture with media images, news images, conversations we heard at home, our education. Think of that as a fog we've been breathing our whole life. We'd never even realized it, what we were taking in.
And that fog causes associations that lead to biases.
I somehow know that if you say peanut butter, I'm going to say jelly. That's an association that's been ingrained in me because throughout my life, peanut butter and jelly are together. And in many forms of media, there's an over-representation of Black men and violent crime being paired together.
And because of that, I actually deep down inside have been taught that Black men are violent and aggressive and not to be trusted, that they're criminals, that they're thugs.
With all those associations, I'm not trying to let us off the hook, but in some ways, none of us stood a chance.
Starting today, we'll post a video a day dealing with one challenge of understanding implicit bias and its relationship to race and exploring ways we might combat the problem. One more thing, if you're seeing this and thinking that it doesn't apply to you, well, you might be falling prey to the blind spot bias. That's the scientific name for a mental bias that allows you to see biases in others, but not in yourself. We're biased.
All right. So go ahead and add a few more words in the chat box to add to this definition or this understanding of implicit bias. I'll give you just a moment to do that. Someone said the idea that it was a fog that we've been breathing our whole lives. Yeah, that's powerful. Very powerful word. Ingrained associations. Yeah. Culturally driven by media. Yes. Strong. And you can go ahead to the next slide. Thank you, James. Well, I guess the most comforting piece of that would be that everyone has biases. Everyone has biases, and it is a part of who we are, and it's a part of being human. And it's not, what's the word? I should say, it's not about accusing people or even providing like a test where people will fail or even looking at flaws. It's almost like a survival mechanism, which now has serious consequences and is a significant barrier as we strive for equal society. But as you understand the work that we are doing, we have to unravel this automatic process in order to achieve that outcome. So the outcome that we're striving for, we have to really work hard to unravel this automatic process. But we need to remember our why. So let's take one more look. And this one is what John Amechi, I always say his name wrong. Obi has to say about it. So again, while you're watching the video, when it comes up, I want you to think also of what's being said, and just place a few more words in this in the chat as we're continuing to define for ourselves and clarify for ourselves. James will have the video up in just a moment.
Let's, if we can, try to define what exactly is that covert, that subconscious bias. What exactly does that mean?
So I struggle sometimes with the language that we use, because the unconscious is a thing. It is a concept in psychology, and bias is a real thing. But we mix the two together, and it's a very unclear picture. I've talked before about the fact, and you've heard here with Jamelia and others, the things that people have done. And the moment it lives in the real world and not in our head, it stops being unconscious. So if someone walks towards me and because whatever, they cross the street, the act of crossing the street is quite a conscious act. The fact that it's derived from a nebulous, difficult to define feeling that's inside them of discomfort is one thing, but it doesn't make the act of crossing the street, the act of not hiring a person, the act of whatever it is, questioning whether you should be in the neighborhood or whatever, it doesn't make that an unconscious act. So these are subtle behaviors, but if you are on the receiving end of that, it's not particularly subtle. When people cross the street, when they see you coming, it's pretty obvious. And after a while, that trend has a real impact.
So with that, there was a kind of a difficulty in defining that. So if it's so difficult to define, how on earth do you even tackle it?
It's not too difficult. For most people watching this, you will have had a wince moment, a moment that you can think back on right now, where you had an uncomfortable interaction with someone who's different than you. It might be somebody who's perhaps a wheelchair user. It might be an LGBT person. It might be a Black person. But you'll have a wince moment where the differences between you suddenly crystallized in you, and you had a sense of urgency, a sense of panic, a sense of I don't know what to say or do. And you may have even at that point misstepped. You may have even had that wince moment when you just abdicated responsibility to stand up when that sexist joke was told or when that racist thing was said. You can learn from those moments. That discomfort can be a teacher. But what you have to do is acknowledge you have them. One of the problems with defeating this everyday racism is the idea that people don't want to address the fact they think it's the worst thing in the world to consider that they've ever done anything biased, but we all have. Embracing that can prevent us from making the same mistake again. Ignoring that makes us a dangerous weapon in society.
And really quickly, how have you dealt with it? Very quickly, if you can, John, if you can.
I try, as a psychologist, to believe the best in people. I maintain that that is the way forward, and I hope that this will be a pivotal moment for change for everybody.
Okay, John Amici, really good at good talking, and some really good advice there as well. Thank you.
Really resonates with me when he talks about this idea of a wince moment. And all right, let's go. Yeah, this whole idea of a wince moment is important, and it's important for us because we have to recognize that it's something that happens, and it's not like we were talking about. It's automated, and it's from things that are driven. The world around us drives those ideas. Go ahead and continue putting ideas into the chat so we can use that as we continue to talk about this. I also think about the whole idea that we consider it unconscious, and some would consider it not deliberate, but it is nonetheless an overt act which affects people, the opportunities in their lives. Consider our work and the decisions that we have to make when we are working with the assessments and our candidates. If we ignore the bias, which what overt consequences does it silently condone? What would we add, anything else to our growing list that we have right here? Thank you. So moving to the next slide. So something to remember as we think about this is that this is not a new discussion. This discussion has been taking place for decades. And our assumptions and beliefs, they trigger our behaviors. And it is the system. It's a system, a cycle that we're caught up in, a cycle which reaffirms and returns to the same old rut. You know, grooves of behavior just ingrained, and they trap us. And our assumptions and beliefs, they created our world. This is something that comes from Matsui and from Claremont. And we create this world. So if we wish the world to be different, we need to build it, one belief at a time. And our job, excuse me, our job is to find out just how to do that. So learning to improve the state that we're in, what works for who, under what circumstances, how do we do this work? So when we're considering our language, and when we're considering our candidates, and when we're considering the work that we're doing, when we talk about implicit bias, we have to be aware of how prevalent it is and how the consequences are real, not just for others, but for ourselves also. So it is even ingrained in our language. So look at it, and again, the next video is So let's look at it again, and this time with Jackson Katz. It's another video that we're going to be looking at, and we're going to work through this idea of gender violence prevention, and how the language that we use can actually perpetuate abusive systems also. So again, while the video is going, we're going to be writing and adding to our list. I see in our list we have something, subtle behaviors. It's true, subtle behaviors. We don't think about those behaviors, and they happen. It's true, they're very subtle.
Before I begin my presentation, I want to say it's a great honor for me to be part of a program with so many impressive women. I also want to say, and thank you to the organizers to invite me to be part of this. It's important that I say, and that men say, when we do the work that we do, and especially in the field of gender violence prevention that I'm going to talk with you about this morning, it's important that we acknowledge that the growing movement of men in the United States, in a multicultural sense, and all around the world in an international sense, the growing movement of men who are standing up and speaking out about men's violence against women and going into parts of male culture that have historically been either apathetic about or openly hostile to women's efforts to engage them. That movement of men is indebted to the leadership of women on a personal level, on a professional level, on a political level, on an intellectual level, on every level. Women built these movements, and these are movements that are affecting, in a positive way, everybody, not just women and girls, but also men and boys. And oftentimes men like myself get a lot of credit and public acclaim for doing the work that women have been doing for a long time. So one of the ways that we can use the spotlight is to thank women and honor women's leadership going forward today, tomorrow, and into the future. Now, having said that, I'm going to share with you a paradigm-shifting perspective on the issues of gender violence, sexual assault, domestic violence, relationship abuse, sexual harassment, sexual abuse of children, that whole range of issues that I'll refer to in shorthand as gender violence issues. They've been seen as women's issues that some good men help out with. But I have a problem with that frame, and I don't accept it. I don't see these as women's issues that some good men help out with. In fact, I'm going to argue that these are men's issues, first and foremost. Now, obviously, there are also women's issues, so I appreciate that. But calling gender violence a women's issue is part of the problem for a number of reasons. The first is that it gives men an excuse not to pay attention. Right? A lot of men hear the term women's issues and we tend to tune it out and we think, hey, I'm a guy, that's for the girls or that's for the women. And a lot of men literally don't get beyond the first sentence as a result. It's almost like a chip in our brain is activated and the neural pathways take our attention in a different direction when we hear the term women's issues. This is also true, by the way, of the word gender, because a lot of people hear the word gender and they think it means women. So they think that gender issues is synonymous with women's issues. There's some confusion about the term gender. And actually, let me illustrate that confusion by way of analogy. So let's talk for a moment about race. In the US, when we hear the word race, a lot of people think that means African American, Latino, Asian American, Native American, South Asian, Pacific Islander, on and on. A lot of people, when they hear the word sexual orientation, think it means gay, lesbian, bisexual. And a lot of people, when they hear the word gender, think it means women. In each case, the dominant group doesn't get paid attention to, right? As if white people don't have some sort of racial identity or belong to some racial category or construct. As if heterosexual people don't have a sexual orientation. As if men don't have a gender. This is one of the ways that dominant systems maintain and reproduce themselves, which is to say the dominant group is rarely challenged to even think about its dominance, because that's one of the key characteristics of power and privilege, the ability to go unexamined. It starts with a very basic English sentence. John beat Mary. That's a good English sentence. John is the subject, beat is the verb, Mary is the object. Good sentence. Now we're going to move to the second sentence, which says the same thing in the passive voice. Mary was beaten by John. And now a whole lot has happened in one sentence. We've gone from John beat Mary to Mary was beaten by John. We've shifted our focus in one sentence from John to Mary. And you can see John is very close to the end of the sentence, well, close to dropping off the map of our psychic plane. The third sentence, John is dropped, and we have Mary was beaten, and now it's all about Mary. We're not even thinking about John, it's totally focused on Mary. Over the past generation, the term we've used synonymous with beaten is battered, so we have Mary was battered. And the final sentence in this sequence, flowing from the others, is Mary is a battered woman. So now Mary's very identity, Mary is a battered woman, is what was done to her by John in the first instance. But we've demonstrated that John has long ago left the conversation. Now, those of us who work in domestic and sexual violence field know that victim blaming is pervasive in this realm, which is to say blaming the person to whom something was done rather than the person who did it. And we say things like, why do these women go out with these men? Why are they attracted to these men? Why do they keep going back? What was she wearing at that party? What a stupid thing to do. Why was she drinking with that group of guys in that hotel room? This is victim blaming. And there are numerous reasons for it, but one of them is that our whole cognitive structure is set up to blame victims. This is all unconscious. Our whole cognitive structure is set up to ask questions about women and women's choices and what they're doing, thinking, and wearing. And I'm not going to shout down people who ask questions about women, okay? It's a legitimate thing to ask. But let's be clear, asking questions about Mary is not going to get us anywhere in terms of preventing violence. We have to ask a different set of questions. And you can see where I'm going with this, right? The questions are not about Mary, they're about John. The questions include things like, why does John beat Mary? Why is domestic violence still a big problem in the United States and all over the world? What's going on? Why do so many men abuse physically, emotionally, and verbally and other ways the women and girls and the men and boys that they claim to love? What's going on with men? Why do so many adult men sexually abuse little girls and little boys? Why is that a common problem in our society and all over the world today? Why? Why do we hear over and over again about new scandals erupting in major institutions like the Catholic Church or the Penn State football program or the Boy Scouts of America, on and on and on, and then local communities all over the country and all the world, right? We hear about it all the time. Sexual abuse of children. What's going on with men? Why do so many men rape women in our society and around the world? Why do so many men rape other men? What is going on with men? And then what is the role of the various institutions in our society that are helping to produce abusive men at pandemic rates? Because this isn't about individual perpetrators. That's a naive way to understanding what is a much deeper and more systematic social problem. You know, the perpetrators aren't these, monsters who cry.
So we've been able to see, as we develop this collective definition, if you will, we started off with the words regarding a basic definition of implicit bias, followed by 2 important videos that added to our collective definition. I want you to do a couple of things for us. First things first, we know that we are all here because we have a role to play in the programs that we support. So we didn't get a chance to honor the role that you play as we develop this collective definition. So as we continue to talk about this, and we're gonna go back one slide back to, well, that's fine, we can stay there. Please do me a favor and put in the chat what role you play with respect to your program. so that as we're developing this definition and talking about how much power words have, we're able to kind of understand where we're all coming from. So take a moment now and add your role into the chat. And we understand that many of you have multiple roles, but what's your primary role? Are you guys able to hear me? Perfect. We've got a mentor teacher coming in, a student teacher program coordinator. So as you guys keep those coming, because we want to know who's in this space together. And we all have had a chance to see this very powerful video about words and how our cognitive structure impacts not only what we process, but how we do it. So as you're entering that, those who've entered their title already, please let us know what this video added to your, what additional layer do you now see that maybe not have been there before? What about words and their structure are you thinking about with respect to how bias is formed in us? So if you'd like to, go ahead and put that in the chat. And again, this is that part of that community where we're building this shared definition. We know that some of you could be running this training yourselves, but we really appreciate you giving of your time and your information. If you're anything like me, I am moved by the fact that words have so much power and in such a way that we sometimes don't pay attention to it. I'll give you some examples because as we're working with candidates and as we are going through these processes together, there's certain things that we have to be careful about, right? So for example, as a person who's experienced this, one example that I'm going to share with you, I invite you to ask yourself, is a student a homeless student, or are they a student experiencing homelessness? We want to be very careful before we create conditions that put our individuals in a box and perpetuate some of the stereotypes and issues that we sometimes face. Another thing thinking about it is that you have this idea of a student, a special needs student. We don't think asset-based first. We put the issue in the front, and that in some cases can turn to define them. And that's not what we're looking for, right? These are students with individual needs. And in some cases, for example, a student that is a person who is autistic will tell you, this is who I am. It is not necessarily a disability. So how do we begin to unravel these attitudes? What can we do about it? And what assumptions and beliefs are we willing to examine for ourselves? We hope that as you are seeing this information and we're developing this collective definition, that there's an understanding that there is not one person and one way to do this, but together, if we unravel these thoughts and assumptions, then we can definitely assure that we'll be moving in the right direction together. So Delia's gonna take us into our next slide, and we'll go ahead and move forward. Thank you very much for putting your positions and your thoughts in the chat. We really appreciate you.
So we have this incredible challenge before us. We can see the effects of implicit bias. And remember, though it may be unconscious, even subconscious, or they're not aware of it, it can have overt consequences. So what do? What opportunity, as we coach and mentor candidates for them to pass the CalTPA, what opportunities are for them to grapple with ideas they may not even be aware of? This is where cultural proficiency comes in. And usually how I name it is, how do we go from yikes to yes? Look at this definition of cultural proficiency. In the chat room, please put in 1 or 2 words that you think are significant, okay, or that really, really deepen your understanding about what this challenge is. So if you can take that and put it in, because here's what I want to point out. What this definition gives us, it states that we have to look at our behaviors. We have to look at our personal values and how they affect the policies and practices, our behavior. And if we really want to be effective with the communities we serve, we have to actively reflect. Okay? Actively reflect. Oh, I see. We went up one, I had one slide, but let's go to this slide. So the first tool I want to share with you is the continuum. Here's the continuum. and to understand the behaviors that we see enacted out in schools. So let's look at cultural destructiveness. Now, the examples used of cultural destructiveness are usually pretty huge. So for instance, the Holocaust, slavery, right? And there's an active movement of destroying that culture. And many times people will say to me, oh, well, we don't really quite see that at schools. Indeed, we do. If you've worked at a school that has barriers for students to actively not have access to some of the things they need to succeed, that's destructive. And I can share this with you. How many of you seen, especially in secondary level, where people have put in all these requirements in order to take an AP course? You have to have at least 2 years of A's in your English class. You have to write an essay. You have to, there's all these barriers people have placed in. And people are shocked when you say, well, what if the child really wants to take the class, why don't we let them take the class? Schools are abound with things that actively limit kids from those opportunities. Or how about services or enrichment activities that are meant for gifted students, but not for EL students? Again, placing a barrier. Remember that first image? Are we placing a fence or are we opening up the fence? Next one is cultural incapacity. Okay? Again, and the kind of language you hear here is a dismissing of other groups. Okay? They don't value, they don't care. Okay? They have the problem. Really stating about students is that it is their problem and not something that I am capable of addressing as an educator, as a teacher, and in my case, as an administrator. The statement is there's something wrong with them. And here are the trigger words. They lack, they don't have, they do not care, they do not value. The next stage is cultural blindness. In cultural blindness, people will say things like, I don't see race, I don't see color, I just see kids. But the question is, if I'm providing service to a child who's experiencing homelessness, can I really treat them the same as any other child? Am I blind to the needs they have simply because I'm going to treat everyone equal? Remember that image? Is equal enough? Or are we talking about equity? Making sure they have the access to the same education, the different thought. Then we have, and again, and this is where a shift begins, we have pre-competence. It's when we're working with people who have an idea. They have an idea that something needs to be done. They're kind of aware of a system and practices that need to be addressed, but they don't feel they have the tools. So they can express it, but they don't know what to do. And people will say, I've tried this, I've tried that, I don't know what's going to work, I'm getting frustrated. So in a sense, but this is a very healthy one of people being acknowledged that something needs to be done. Then there's cultural competence. And what occurs here is someone is willing to try something. Let me try that strategy. Let me try that technique. Let's talk about it. How did it work? So and think about the things you do in TPA. They're actually struggling with that. What do these children need? What are you willing to try? So in cultural proficiency, what occurs is you've not only experimented, you've learned ways to bring it into the entire community and see that these are actively institutionalized and that the conversation is ongoing, okay? So think about that and about how we can move people and mentor them to this other behavior, going from unhealthy to healthy behaviors. Next slide. And that's the point. This is not blaming or beating anyone up. Is it unhealthy or healthy behaviors? And we can use the opportunity as they write, as they see that language, okay, to move them from unhealthy to healthy behaviors. Okay. Next slide. And here are the verbs. Are they assessing what they know? Are they valuing the diversity? Do they know how to manage difference? Remember, conflict is natural. We all have it. But do we have ways of managing it, even within ourselves? And are we adapting to the challenges we're seeing? Or are we just saying, no, it's got to be, it's always been? And that's, do we institutionalize it? Does it become the way we do things? And again, and it's not just talking about being equity driven, it's about being equity driven. Next slide. So when we talk about cultural proficiency, if you can click again, remember it's an inside out approach. Click again. Being aware of who we are and how we are as individuals in the schools, and we can help our candidates do that. Be aware of how we respond to people who are different from us. Visible and not so visible differences. Okay, sometimes you can't always tell class. We have to be prepared to live in a world of difference. And one more time. You can click again, please. It's a worldview, it's a mindset, and it's a manner in which we live our lives. Okay, it cannot be mandated. You can nurture it in your candidates. Next. And here are the pivotal questions that they need to ask themselves. Who am I as an educator? Am I who I say I am? And who are we as an organization? And are we who we say we are? And why do we do the things we do? Next.
So how do we, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
So how do we start to build this understanding of our ability? We need to reflect, and we need to have dialogue. We need to think through our understanding, but we also need to talk. We need to have discussions. We need to make sure that we are coming together to learn and organize our understandings. There's so many resources. You can go to the next slide. There's so many resources that are out there. And I know that you all, this list is the set that we have up on the screen is just a few. And I would love to invite you all to add to this list by dropping something in the chat. If you have another resource that you would say, this is great and you should look at this, drop it in the chat for others to see. That's a great thing. So this, again, is just a sampling of the resources that are out there, but there are tons of them. So drop something in the chat so that we can continue to do this work together and learn and work together. Next slide. So when we're talking about bias, we need to understand how do we do that, and using those resources from the previous page and the ones that our colleagues are dropping into the chat right now. We have to continue that understanding, the reflection, the dialogue, building our proficiency. It's not just one day, but it's one day at a time. It's continually, it's over and it's over, and we'll draw closer and closer to a better understanding of ourselves and of others. Next slide.
All right, so we're going to talk about bias, especially as it relates to assessment and a little bit about that. But before we do that, we're noticing that the time is now 10:55, and we do respect and honor your time. So please know that if you have another commitment at the hour at 11 o'clock, it's perfectly okay to drop off. We're almost done. We just have a couple more slides and a very powerful video that we want you to see, but we want to make sure that we understand if you have to go. So let's talk about this idea about bias. We know that it happens, especially with respect to our assessments. If there are certain things that occur that impact an ability of the person's true merit to be measured. And it's important for you to know that the commission has taken great efforts to ensure that everyone is receiving training to prevent the possibility of that happening, including but not limited to our assessors and every individual that touches this project. So we're developing these code definitions and ensuring that everyone is being aware and trying to eliminate their bias as time goes on. So let's go to the next slide and talk a little bit about some of the things that may pop up for you when you're working with individuals and candidates and you're coaching. We have people from every single area, including student teachers here. And I think that that's a great wealth of information. Here's some things that you might see. You may hear someone say, it's clear that the parents lack self-efficacy. and cannot foster this in their children. Do you see a hint of bias there? English learners do not have the English skills to engage in critical thinking activities. If you'd like in the chat, especially for that second one, what might be one of the issues with that statement, as well as if anyone would offer what type of questions that you might think that person would need to hear to examine that bias. So we have this idea of these, that the English learners don't have the skills to engage in critical thinking activities. And the sad part is these are actual things that we've seen typed and said. So as you're putting that kind of information in the chat, you may even hear someone say that Black students don't value education and the families do not prioritize school. We have to be thinking of ways to assert a different thought process for well-meaning individuals. The next slide, well, the next thing we're going to show you is a video of a reimagined doll test. So some of you guys are familiar with the doll test that originally happened in the 1940s. In the video that we're going to see, the doll test was recreated in about 2016 with Italian children. It is important to note that the original one was in the 40s and this one was in 2016. And some of the same outcomes were actually the exact same outcomes happened in our current time. I want you to know that for some, this video may be triggering due to the serious nature of it. And we want to honor that and give you a moment to process that for those who need it at the end of this. But we're going to go ahead and play the video. And I want you to take note of how similar the results are from the original test in the 1940s in an entirely different country. We'll go ahead and
James, just so you know, the video is embedded in the PowerPoint, so you don't have to go to YouTube on this one.
And again, as that's coming up, once we hit 11, if you have to go, we understand, but this is our last piece. So if you're able to stick with us, we definitely would love to have you.
Okay, so I apologize for bringing us out. I'm going to get back into it and we will play the video. Thank you for letting me know that it's embedded.
James, are you able to go full screen?
Quale bambola è bianca? Quale bambola è nera? Quale delle due è bella?
Questa.
Qual è quella bella? Qual è quella brutta?
You're on mute, James.
I know we're in presentation mode. Give me just a quick moment. I apologize. Is this okay? All right.
E qual è quella buona? Quale è cattiva? Qual è buona?
Lei.
Perché è buona?
Perché ha gli occhi celesti.
Quale è cattiva? Perché è cattiva?
Perché è tutto nero.
E qual è la bambola che ti somiglia di più? Quale bambola è nera?
Mi ha offeso.
Chi?
Tu.
Perché?
Perché mi hai chiamato nero.
Perché ti offendi?
Mi offendi perché altri bambini mi hanno offeso con cattiveria.
No, io non ho usato nessuna cattiveria.
Quello mi sta guardando storto.
Okay. So if we go to the last slide. That is a very challenging video for us as educators, because what it illustrates is that we've been very effective in our teaching, and they have learned the lesson of what is valued and what is not valued. So either we take this seriously and we continue to take these opportunities to help people not only clarify their own values, but what it means we have been given the great honor of teaching our children. So I'd like to leave you with one final thought. Okay, James?
Hold on just a moment. I apologize.
No, it's okay. And you'll see this in a second, but I'm going to start reading it to you. We don't have to wait for some grand utopian future. The future is an infinite succession of presents, and to live now as we think human beings should live, in defiance of all that is bad around us, is in itself a marvelous victory. And that's from Howard Zinn, historian. You may be familiar with him. He wrote the People's History of the United States. Think about that, and as we have these conversations, hopefully we'll continue them, and we'll get better at doing that, making sure every child feels they have a place in the world and is respected. Thank you for taking the time for having this conversation with us.
And thank you, Kitty, Letitia, and Delia, for providing this very important information. And just to leave, if you always have, know that if you have technical questions, you can email ES. If there are policy questions, the email for the CalTPA mailbox is listed here. And as we always know, the information that we have with regard to our website is listed here. What I'd like to do now is I'm going to bring us back to a gallery view, and just again want to thank our three presenters today with such great information. That last video is so powerful, and it really just brings up a lot of things that we need to really, there's still a lot of work that we need to do in our schools, in our programs, and with our own children. Amy, are there any last ideas that you would like to share with the group before we wrap this up?
Nope, I just want to also thank so much Kitty, Letitia, and Delia for sharing their expertise with us and holding this conversation. And we invite all of you to continue to share your resources. And as a learning community, looking forward to working with you as we continue to ensure that implicit bias does not interrupt our work as educators. So with that, I just would like to say thank you, and then maybe just turn it back to our three facilitators to see if there are any lingering questions in the chat, or if we can address anything for any of you with us today.